happens in the space between a heartbeat and a muzzle flash. A rainy alleyway, the smell of gunpowder, and the sudden terrifying weight of a body shielding hers. Zora doesn't even have time to scream. The last thing she sees before the world turns to a blur of neon pink and cold gray is a man standing over her in the downpour. He's sharp, dangerous, with a dragon crawling up his neck like a history written where it couldn't be hidden. He doesn't panic. He doesn't even flinch at the blood on his own palm. He just looks at her, really looks at her, and gives the order that shatters her quiet world forever. She stays with me. The streets aren't safe tonight. Later, when the adrenaline fades, Zora is no longer just a maid in a ruffled apron. She is the keeper of a secret buried inside a broken, heart-shaped locket, a secret that a powerful man has been running from his entire life. Somewhere in the heart of Seoul, Kang Ji-Hoon, a man who built an empire on cold efficiency, can't sleep. Because for the first time in a decade, the bleeding dragon has found something he's actually afraid to lose. Before we dive into the shadows of the Seoul underworld, make sure to join the family. Hit that like button, subscribe to Mafia Moonlight Tales, and share this story with someone who believes in the power of redemption. Drop a comment below letting me know which city you're watching from. I love seeing where our global syndicate is tuning in. Now let's go entirely into the story. Zora Vance always found her peace when the city grew loud. As a maid in the high-stakes world of the elite, she had learned the art of being invisible. To be a black girl in a white apron, in this part of the world meant being a ghost, someone who cleaned the messes but never made them. She didn't want trouble. She wanted the truth about the faded photos in her locket. That Valentine's evening, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and cheap rain. Zora had left the mansion with nothing but a single red rose and the locket pressed against her chest. She wasn't looking for romance. She was looking for a way out. She walked with her head down, staying in the lanes that belonged to her, unaware that the shadows were shifting. She glanced at her locket for half a second. That was all it took. The black sedans appeared like sharks in a shallow pool. Professional, lethal, confident in their right-of-way. An ambush intended for a king, but Zora was the one standing in the crossfire. The world fractured into the sound of shattering glass and the heavy thud of lead hitting brick. Someone moved. Someone caught her before she hit the wet asphalt. The man who knelt over her wasn't a savior. He was the target. Kang Ji-Hoon. He was the kind of man who survived by knowing exactly when mercy cost too much. His neck tattoos were older than his regrets, marks of a life he had been trying to clean before the past caught up. He was supposed to be sealing a deal that would end a war. Instead, fate put a maid in the path of a bullet meant for him. He looked at her trembling hands, then down at the broken locket lying in the puddle between them. His eyes widened. He didn't shout. He spoke with a quiet, terrifying authority that silenced the rain. The hospital is too far. Take her to my private quarters. Now. Darkness took Zora, but as Ji-Hoon picked up the broken piece of her locket, he saw a face from his past, a debt of honor he thought had died years ago. He had spent his life in the dark, but looking at the girl in the ruffled apron, he realized that tonight the bleeding dragon would have to choose. His empire or her light. The rain in Seoul didn't fall. It descended like a heavy gray curtain, blurring the neon pink glare of the Valentine's Day displays into jagged streaks of light. For Zora Vance, the holiday was merely a shift to endure. As a domestic maid for the Kang estate, she was used to moving through the shadows of the elite like a ghost in a ruffled apron. Her world was one of polished marble and silent obedience, a stark contrast to the restless, ink-stained soul of the man she served. She stepped out into the humid evening air, clutching a single red rose, a discarded gift from a centerpiece she'd been told to clear. It was a small, fragile bit of beauty in a life defined by invisibility. To her, the rose was a symbol of a world she could observe but never touch. To her employer, Kang Ji-Hoon, everything had a price, and beauty was often just a mask for a debt. Zora walked toward the service entrance of the high-end district, her thumb tracing the smooth metal of the heart-shaped locket beneath her coat. It was her only anchor, a piece of heritage she carried through a city that saw her as an outsider. The street was unusually quiet, the typical Valentine's bustle dampened by the downpour. A black sedan glided to the curb, its engine a low, predatory hum. Ji-Hoon stepped out, his presence immediately commanding the space around him. He looked every bit the bleeding dragon, his dark overcoat tailored to perfection, his gaze cold and analytical, and the tattoos on his neck crawling toward his jawline like a warning etched in skin. He didn't look at Zora as she stood by the alleyway. To him, she was part of the architecture. Then, the rhythm of the rain was shattered. The sound wasn't a bang, it was a sharp, metallic crack that bit through the atmosphere. A hitman's bullet, intended for the center of Ji-Hoon's chest, ricocheted off the car's reinforced frame. Time didn't slow down, it fractured. Zora didn't have time to scream or run. She saw the flash from the rooftop across the street, a spark of lethal intent in the darkness. Instinct, raw and unbidden, took hold of Ji-Hoon. He didn't dive for cover alone. He lunged toward the girl in the apron, his large frame slamming into her as a second shot whistled through the space where her head had been a second before. They hit the wet asphalt together. The impact stole the breath from Zora's lungs, the cold rainwater soaking instantly into her uniform. Above them, the neon heart of a nearby storefront flickered, casting a sickly pink glow over the chaos. Ji-Hoon's hand, calloused and powerful, pressed her head down against the pavement. "Don't move," he hissed, his voice a low vibration against her ear. Zora looked up, her vision blurred by tears and rain. The red rose lay crushed in a puddle a few inches away, its petals scattered like drops of blood. But it was the sight of Ji-Hoon's palm that stopped her heart. A fresh graze from the bullet had torn his skin, and as his blood mingled with the rainwater, it dripped onto her white apron, staining the ruffles crimson. The quiet shift was over. The invisibility she had cultivated for years was gone. In the eyes of the most dangerous man in Seoul, Zora was finally seen, not as a maid, but as the only living thing he had chosen to save. The second shot bit into the brickwork just inches above them, showering Zora's hair with grit and dust. Before she could process the sting of the debris, Ji-Hoon was moving. With a fluid, terrifying grace, he surged upward, his body a living shield between her and the unseen killer on the heights. He didn't look like a man under fire. He looked like a predator reclaiming his territory. One hand reached into the inner lining of his coat, while the other, the one dripping with a fresh, jagged crimson, reached down for her. "Get up," he commanded. The words weren't a request. They were an anchor in the storm of her panic. Zora reached out, her fingers trembling as they met his palm. His skin was burning hot despite the freezing rain, and as his fingers closed around hers to hoist her from the asphalt, the blood from his wound smeared across her knuckles. She stumbled to her feet, her breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. The world was a blur of neon pink light and iron-scented rain, but as she stood, the chain around her neck snapped. The locket hit the wet pavement with a hollow, metallic clink. It bounced once and fell open, the delicate hinge forced wide by the impact. Ji-Hoon's gaze, which had been scanning the rooftops for the next muzzle flash, dropped to the ground. For a heartbeat, the violence of the night suspended itself. He stood over her, the dragon on his neck appearing to writhe as his muscles tensed, his bleeding hand still outstretched. He leaned down, his large frame casting a shadow that swallowed her whole, and retrieved the trinket. Zora watched, paralyzed, as the man who held the fate of the city's underworld in his grip stared at the tiny water-damaged photographs inside. One side held a grainy image of a baby. The other, a small, hand-etched symbol of a soaring phoenix entwined with a spear. The air in the alleyway seemed to thin. Ji-Hoon looked at his own bleeding palm, where the bullet had carved a path through his flesh. The wound was jagged raw, and as the blood cleared slightly in the rain, it formed a striking, accidental mirror to the symbol in the silver heart. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was a ghost. "Where did you get this?" His voice dropped to a low, dangerous register, stripped of its previous cold efficiency. There was a tremor there now, something that sounded horribly like recognition. Zora couldn't speak. She could only stare at the blood on his hand, then at the locket, then at the man whose name was whispered in fear across Seoul. The bleeding dragon wasn't looking at a maid anymore. He was looking at a legacy. He closed his fist around the locket, the metal biting into his injury, mixing his lifeblood with her history. A shout echoed from the end of the alley. His security detail arriving late, guns drawn, tires screeching against the rain-slicked road. Ji-Hoon didn't turn. He kept his eyes locked on Zora's, his expression unreadable behind a mask of rain and shadow. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming, and tucked the broken locket into his breast pocket, right over his heart. "You aren't going back to the estate, Zora," he whispered, his hand resting briefly on her shoulder, leaving a red print on the white lace of her collar. "You're coming with me. We have a debt to discuss." The penthouse was a fortress of glass and silence, high above the neon arteries of Seoul. Inside, the only sound was the rhythmic drumming of rain against the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ji-Hoon sat in a high-backed leather chair, his movements stiff from the adrenaline crash. He had dismissed his security, leaving only the low amber glow of a desk lamp to cut through the shadows. Zora stood by the window, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket that felt far too expensive for her skin. Her eyes fixed on the city lights as if searching for the life she had just lost. Ji-Hoon reached into his breast pocket and withdrew the broken locket. The silver was cold, stained with a dark, dried rust where his blood had seeped into the hinges. With the precision of a man who handled delicate weapons, he pried it open. The light hit the grainy photograph of the infant, a tiny, innocent face that seemed impossible in a room built on violence. His breath hitched. He didn't just recognize the face. He recognized the soul behind the symbol etched into the silver. Memory hit him like a physical blow. 15 years ago, a different rain, a different alley. He had been a foot soldier then, bleeding out from a gut wound, abandoned by his own kin. A man, a foreigner with kind eyes and a steady hand, had stepped out of the darkness. He wasn't a gangster. He was a doctor, a traveler, a man who believed in the sanctity of life. He had hidden Ji-Hoon, stitched his skin with fishing wire, and stood between him and the men sent to finish the job. When Ji-Hoon had asked why a stranger would risk everything for a monster, the man had simply shown him this locket. "For my daughter," he had said. "So she grows up in a world where men still choose to be human." Ji-Hoon's gaze shifted from the photo to Zora. She was trembling, her dark skin pale under the flickering lamp, her ruffled apron a ruined rag of lace and iron stains. The realization settled in his chest like lead. The man who had given him his life was gone, but his legacy was standing in Ji-Hoon's living room, scrubbing floors for the very empire that had nearly swallowed her father. He stood up, the locket clicking shut in his palm. The bleeding dragon was gone, replaced by a man haunted by a ghost. He walked toward her, his footsteps heavy on the polished wood. Zora flinched as he approached, her eyes darting to his bandaged hand, but he didn't reach for a weapon. Instead, he held out the silver heart. "Your father," Ji-Hoon said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that broke the silence of the room. His name was Elias Vance. He was a man of peace in a city of wolves. Zora looked up, her breath catching. You knew him." Ji-Hoon looked out at the rain, his reflection in the glass looking older than his years. "He saved me when the world wanted me dead. He gave me a future I didn't deserve." He turned back to her, his expression hardening into a new, fierce resolve. "I have spent my life breaking things, Zora. But for him, for you, I am going to make sure the cycle stops here." The debt of honor was no longer a memory. It was a living, breathing girl, and Ji-Hoon knew that to protect her, he would have to burn down the very world he had spent a lifetime building. The air in the boardroom of the Kang Corporation was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the unspoken tension of men who survived by measuring power in blood. The high-ranking lieutenants of the syndicate sat around the heavy obsidian table, their faces masks of stone. They were restless. A failed assassination attempt usually demanded a retaliatory strike, a display of force that turned the streets red. Instead, they had been summoned to wait. The heavy double doors swung open, but it wasn't the sound of Ji-Hoon's polished Oxfords that drew their eyes. It was the soft, hesitant step of a woman. Zora walked in first. She had been cleaned of the alleyway's grime, but the fear still clung to her like a second skin. She wore a simple, elegant silk dress Ji-Hoon had provided, yet her hands were still clasped in front of her in the habitual posture of a servant. Behind her, Ji-Hoon moved like a shadow, his presence cold and absolute. The dragon on his neck seemed to pulse in the harsh overhead lights as he guided Zora toward the head of the table. A low murmur rippled through the room. Ji-Hoon, one of the elders rasped, his eyes narrowing at Zora's dark skin and the visible tremor in her shoulders. We are here to discuss the breach in our security. Why is the domestic help in the inner sanctum? Ji-Hoon didn't answer immediately. He pulled out the chair to his right, the seat traditionally reserved for his most trusted advisor, and waited until Zora sat down. Only then did he move to the head of the table, leaning forward until his bandaged palm rested flat on the obsidian surface. This is Zora Vance, Ji-Hoon said, his voice a calm, lethal vibration that silenced the room. She is not here to serve your tea or clear your glass. From this moment on, her safety is the syndicate's primary directive. If a single hair on her head is harmed, I will consider it an act of war against my own blood. The shock was palpable. A lieutenant at the far end of the table scoffed, his hand twitching toward the weapon concealed in his jacket. She's a maid, Ji-Hoon. Foreigner. You're risking the stability of the family for a girl who doesn't even know which world she's stepped into. Ji-Hoon's gaze snapped to the speaker, sharp and predatory. She is the daughter of the man who kept this family from burying me 15 years ago. She is a legacy of honor in a room full of thieves. He reached into his pocket and placed the broken silver locket on the table. It slid across the polished stone, stopping in the center of the room like a challenge. The old world is built on debts. This is the one I am calling in. Zora looked at the men around her, men who saw her as a weakness, a target, or a mistake. She felt the weight of their judgment, but then she felt Ji-Hoon's hand momentarily steady her shoulder. For the first time, she didn't look at the floor. She looked at the men who ruled the city and realized that she wasn't just a guest. She was the catalyst for a revolution she didn't yet understand. Ji-Hoon looked around the table, his eyes promising fire to anyone who dared to blink. The meeting is over. Start the transition. We are moving our assets into the light. The silence following the boardroom meeting was a deception, a brief intake of breath before a scream. While Ji-Hoon worked in the upper reaches of his tower to dismantle an empire, the old world he sought to leave behind was already clawing its way back. In the underbelly of the city, mercy was not seen as a debt of honor. It was seen as a terminal illness. Zora had retreated to the only place that still felt like hers, the modest staff quarters tucked away at the edge of the estate. She needed the familiar smell of her own tea and the sight of her few belongings to remind her that she was still Zora, not just a pawn in a high-stakes game of shadows. But as she approached the corridor, the air didn't smell of home. It smelled of gasoline, burnt upholstery, and the acrid tang of cold ash. She stopped at the threshold, the blanket Ji-Hoon had given her slipping from her shoulders to the floor. The room had been hollowed out. The walls, once cream and quiet, were blackened and weeping soot. Her bed was a charred skeleton of metal and springs. The photos she had pinned to her mirror, the only links to her life before the Kang estate, were gone, curled into unreadable flakes of gray carbon. It wasn't just a fire. It was an execution of her identity. The rival syndicates had moved with the surgical cruelty they were known for. They hadn't come for Ji-Hoon's life this time. They had come for his hope. Zora stepped into the center of the ruins, her shoes crunching on broken glass. In the middle of her charred vanity, untouched by the flames but surrounded by ash, lay a single object, was a red rose. But it wasn't the fresh, vibrant flower she had held in the rain. This one had been scorched, its petals curled and blackened at the edges, the stem snapped in a way that mimicked a broken neck. It was a message written in the language of the underworld. Whatever you love will burn. A heavy step sounded in the doorway. Ji-Hoon stood there, his face illuminated by the harsh, flickering hallway light. He looked at the wreckage, then at Zora, who was standing amidst the remains of her life with a terrifying, hollow stillness. His jaw tightened, the dragon on his neck pulsing with a dark, violent energy. He had tried to bring her into the light, but the darkness had followed her home. "They think this will stop me," he said, his voice dropping to a low, lethal hum that made the very air in the room vibrate. "They think that by destroying your past, they can control my future." Zora didn't cry. She reached down and picked up the scorched rose, the soot staining her fingertips. She looked at Ji-Hoon, and for the first time, the fear in her eyes was replaced by something sharper, something harder. "They didn't just destroy my room, Ji-Hoon," she whispered, her voice steady despite the chaos. "They reminded me why my father fought so hard to stay clean." Ji-Hoon walked toward her, stepping over the debris of his own world. He took the scorched rose from her hand and crushed it into dust. "Then we burn the rest of it down," he promised, "until there is nothing left of the syndicate but ash." The air in Ji-Hoon's private study was thick with the scent of old leather and the metallic tang of the city's unrest. Rain lashed against the glass, a rhythmic drumming that felt like a countdown. Ji-Hoon stood by the window, his back to the room, watching the neon lights of Seoul fracture through the droplets. Behind him, the heavy click of a lighter sparked. "You're liquidating the Busan accounts," a voice rasped. It was Min-ho, Ji-Hoon's top lieutenant, a man who had been the dragon's shadow since they were boys in the slums. Min-ho didn't sit. He paced the length of the room like a caged animal, the smoke from his cigarette curling into the shadows. "The elders are talking, Ji-Hoon. They're saying the dragon has lost his teeth. They're saying you're trading a kingdom for a maid's smile." Ji-Hoon didn't turn. "I am paying a debt, Min-ho. One that is 15 years overdue." "A debt?" Min-ho laughed, a dry, hollow sound that held no mirth. He stepped closer, his shadow stretching across the floor until it touched Ji-Hoon's heels. "We don't pay debts with mercy. We pay them with lead. You brought that girl into the boardroom. You let her see the faces of the council. And what did it get us? A scorched room and a declaration of war from the Kim syndicate. Mercy costs too much, Ji-Hoon. In our world, it's a luxury that gets everyone buried." Ji-Hoon finally turned, his gaze as cold and sharp as a winter blade. The dragon on his neck seemed to tighten with his jaw. "And what is the alternative? To keep breathing in this filth until our lungs turn to ash? To die in an alleyway just like the men who tried to take us out tonight? The alternative is survival." Min-ho slammed his hand onto the desk, rattling the broken silver locket that still lay there. "You're dismantling everything we built. You're handing our territory over to foundations and charities like we're some kind of Sunday school. If you won't kill the Kims for what they did to her quarters, the men will find a leader who will. They're scared, Ji-Hoon. And scared men are loyal only to the person holding the biggest gun." Ji-Hoon stepped into Min-ho's space, his height imposing, his presence an absolute weight. He didn't reach for the weapon at his hip. Instead, he leaned in until they were inches apart. "I am the one holding the gun, Min-ho. And I am pointing it at the past. If you think my mercy is a weakness, then you've forgotten how I earned these tattoos. Takes no courage to kill. It takes everything to stop." Min-ho's eyes searched his boss's face, looking for the cold-blooded executioner he once knew, but he found only a man with a terrifying new kind of resolve. The lieutenant stepped back, his face a mask of bitter disappointment. "The Kims won't wait for your transformation, Ji-Hoon," Min-ho whispered, dropping his cigarette and crushing it into the expensive rug. "They'll come for her again. And when they do, you'll realize that some ghosts can't be paid off. They only leave when they've taken everything. He turned and walked out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him. Ji-Hoon stood alone in the silence, his hand ghosting over the locket. The cost was rising, and the storm was only just beginning. The penthouse balcony was an island of cold stone suspended in a sea of electric pink and hazy blue. Below them, the city celebrated a version of Valentine's Day that felt like a cruel joke, a fever dream of paper hearts and hollow promises. Zora stood at the railing, the wind whipping her hair across her face, while the giant neon heart of the L'Amour Plaza across the street cast a rhythmic, pulsing glow over her skin. One moment she was bathed in a soft, romantic light. The next, she was swallowed by the harsh, unforgiving shadows of the heights. Ji-Hoon stood a few paces behind her, a dark silhouette against the glass. He didn't offer comfort, and he didn't offer lies. He simply existed there, a guardian whose very presence felt like a threat to the peace he claimed to want. Why? Zora's voice was small, but it cut through the hum of the city like a blade. She didn't turn around. She kept her eyes on the pulsing pink heart. You've lost your men. You've burned your bridges. You're watching your life's work crumble into ash, and you're doing it for a girl who used to scrub your floors. Ji-Hoon remained silent, his breath a faint mist in the cold air. I saw the way they looked at you in that boardroom, she continued, finally turning to face him. The neon light hit her eyes, making the tears there shimmer like oil on water. They look at you like you're a god of death. I've seen the tattoos, Ji-Hoon. I know what the bleeding dragon means. You are a man who has built a throne out of other people's nightmares. She stepped closer, her voice rising with a desperate, frantic energy. So tell me the truth. Why is a monster trying to be my hero? Is it guilt? Is it the locket? Or is this just another game where I'm the prize? Ji-Hoon didn't flinch. He stepped into the pink light, and for the first time the monster looked human. The jagged scar on his hand was raw, and the dragon on his neck seemed trapped under the weight of his heavy overcoat. I am not trying to be a hero, Zora, he said, his voice a low, gravelly confession. A hero fights for what is right. I am only fighting for what is left. He took another step, his shadow merging with hers. Your father didn't save me because I was a good man. He saved me because he believed that even the worst of us could choose a different ending. I spent 15 years proving him wrong. I spent 15 years becoming the thing he feared most. He reached out, his hand hovering near her face before he pulled it back, as if afraid the blood on his soul would stain her. This isn't a game. It's a dismantling. I'm not saving you to feel better about my sins. I'm saving you because you are the only part of my life that isn't covered in ink and regret. If I can't be a good man, I can at least be the man who makes sure you never have to be a ghost again. The neon heart flickered, dying out for a brief second, leaving them in total darkness. In that silence, Zora realized that Ji-Hoon wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for an exit. And she was the only door he had left. The transition didn't happen with a roar, but with the scratching of pens and the clicking of encrypted keys in the dead of night. Inside the glass-walled office, the atmosphere was sterile, stripped of the smoke and bravado that usually defined the Kang Syndicate's dealings. Ji-Hoon sat behind a desk piled high with legal deeds, offshore account transfers, and non-profit charters. He was stripping himself of his armor, layer by layer, converting blood-soaked influence into a currency of hope. Zora sat across from him, watching the digital numbers flicker on the screens. She looked at the documents for the Vance Legacy Foundation, a multi-billion-won entity designed to fund education, healthcare, and protection for the city's most vulnerable. Her name was at the top, listed as the sole presiding director. It was a staggering weight, a mountain of responsibility born from the wreckage of a criminal empire. You're giving it all away, she whispered, her eyes scanning a document that dissolved a lucrative smuggling route into a logistics network for medical supplies. The ports, the real estate, the holdings. If you do this, you'll have no protection left. No one will fear you. Ji-Hoon didn't look up from the screen where he was authorizing the final transfer. The blue light cast sharp, angular shadows across his face, making the dragon on his neck look like a ghost fading into the dawn. Fear is a temporary currency, Zora. It buys silence, but it never buys peace. For 15 years, I've used fear to build a wall. Tonight, I'm using what's left of my power to build a bridge. He turned the laptop toward her. Sign here. With this, the Kang Corporation ceases to exist. Its assets become a shield for people like your father and people like you. It's a clean exit. The money will be untraceable to the old ways, scrubbed by lawyers and legitimate banks. You will have the power to change the lives of thousands. Zora hesitated, her hand hovering over the electronic pad. She looked at Ji-Hoon, seeing the exhaustion etched into the lines around his eyes. He was willfully making himself a target. Without the syndicate, he was just a man with too many enemies and a very long memory. And what happens to you when the world realizes the dragon is gone? Ji-Hoon finally looked at her, a faint, melancholic smile touching his lips. It was the expression of a man who had already accepted his fate. I told you I'm not a hero. I'm just the one clearing the debris. When the foundation is secure, I will be a ghost again. But you will be the light they can't put out. Design. The moment the digital ink settled, a chime echoed through the room, a notification that the final restructuring was complete. The empire had been dismantled from the inside out. In the silence that followed, the weight of the city seemed to shift. The power had moved from the barrel of a gun to the palm of a woman who once believed she had no voice. Ji-Hoon stood up, his movements slow and deliberate. He looked out at the sunrise beginning to bleed over the horizon, turning the gray sky into a bruised purple. The transition was done. The clean life he had promised was now a legal reality, but as the first light of day hit the glass, they both knew that the shadows wouldn't let him walk away without one final, violent reckoning. The Banpo Bridge spanned the Han River like a gargantuan spine of steel and light, but tonight, the rainbow fountains were silent. The air was a cold, biting mist, and the neon pink of the city felt a lifetime away. Ji-Hoon stood at the center of the walkway, the wind tearing at his coat. He was alone, or at least he appeared to be. Behind him, the dawn was a jagged line of gold breaking through the smog of Seoul, the first true daylight he had faced in years. The sound of heavy engines approached from the north. 3 black SUVs skidded to a halt, boxing him in. Doors flew open, and Min-ho stepped out, followed by a dozen men with their hands gripped tight around cold steel and semi-automatics. The betrayal was complete. The old world had come to collect its pound of flesh. It's done, Ji-Hoon, Min-ho shouted over the roar of the wind. His face twisted in a mixture of fury and grief. The accounts are drained. The council is screaming for your head. Give us the keys to the Foundation's overrides, and maybe I'll let you jump instead of throwing you. Ji-Hoon didn't move. He reached into his coat, and the men instinctively leveled their weapons. But he didn't pull a gun. He pulled out the silver locket, now repaired, the metal gleaming in the rising sun. He wrapped the chain around his wounded palm, the one still scarred from the Valentine's Day bullet. I'm not giving you anything, Min-ho, Ji-Hoon said, his voice steady, carrying an authority that didn't need a weapon to back it up. Don't be a fool. You're unarmed. Min-ho stepped forward, his own pistol trembling in his hand. You've spent your life as a monster. You think standing here like a martyr changes that? Use your gun, Ji-Hoon. Fight like the dragon, or die like a coward. Ji-Hoon looked at the dawn, the light reflecting in his eyes. He felt the weight of the firearm tucked into his small of his back, the shadow he had carried for a decade. He could draw it. He could end Min-ho and half the men on the bridge before they even blinked. But he looked at the locket in his hand, the symbol of the man who had chosen to be human in a world of wolves. With a slow, deliberate motion, Ji-Hoon reached back, unholstered his weapon, and tossed it over the railing. It fell into the dark, churning waters of the Han River without a sound. The The silence that followed was deafening. Min-ho stared, paralyzed by an act of defiance he couldn't comprehend. Ji-Hoon stood defenseless, his chest open, his head held high. He was no longer the bleeding dragon. He was a man standing in the light. "If you want to kill me, do it," Ji-Hoon said, taking a step toward the guns. "But the money is gone. The legacy is Zora's. The darkness ends with me." Min-ho's finger tightened on the trigger, his eyes searching Ji-Hoon's for a flicker of fear, but he found only a terrifying peace. The sun broke fully over the horizon then, flooding the bridge with a blinding, uncompromising white. In that moment of absolute clarity, the men lowered their weapons. You cannot kill a man who has already let go of the world. Ji-Hoon walked past them, his shoulder brushing Min-ho's, and he didn't look back. He walked toward the end of the bridge, toward the girl waiting in the distance, leaving the shadows to drown in the river behind him. The transition from the shadow of the syndicate to the clarity of the morning was not a sudden disappearance of the past, but a slow, intentional reconstruction. Months after the bridge, the Vance Legacy Foundation occupied a space that was once a warehouse for contraband. Now it was a sanctuary of glass and greenery, a place where the air felt light and the doors were never locked. Zora stood by a large window overlooking the courtyard, where children from the neighborhood played in the safety of a world they didn't have to fear. She no longer wore the ruffled apron of a servant, but the quiet confidence of a woman who had seen the worst of humanity and chosen to build something better. Around her neck, the silver heart-shaped locket hung once more, its surface polished to a brilliant shine, though the faint seam where it had once been broken remained, a reminder that things can be made whole again, even if the scars persist. Ji-Hoon stood beside her, his presence no longer a weight but a steadying force. He had traded his tailored silk suits for a simple dark sweater, the high collar partially obscuring the dragon on his neck. The tattoos were still there, etched deep into his skin, a permanent map of a journey he could never truly erase. But they no longer felt like a warning to the world. They were a testimony. "People still look at these and see a monster," Ji-Hoon said softly, his gaze following a group of students entering the library downstairs. He looked at the scars on his hand, the mark of the bullet that had first linked his destiny to Zora's. "They see the man you were," Zora replied, turning to him. "But they benefit from the man you chose to become. That is the power of integrity, Ji-Hoon. It's not about never having a past. It's about what you do when the darkness asks you to come back." The moral of their journey was written in the very foundations of the building. It taught that our tattoos, the mistakes, the trauma, and the iron-scented memories, do not define the limit of our worth. Instead, the true measure of a life is found in the moment when staying clean is the most expensive choice a person can make. Ji-Hoon had sacrificed an empire to gain his soul, proving that while blood may stain, it does not have to dictate the future. He reached out and touched the locket. The phoenix entwined with the spear was no longer a secret debt. It was a blueprint for their new life. They had learned that peace isn't just the absence of war, but the presence of justice and the courage to stand unarmed in the face of old ghosts. As the sun reached its zenith, bathing the courtyard in an uncompromising beautiful daylight, Ji-Hoon finally felt the weight of the bleeding dragon lift. He wasn't a hero and he wasn't a king. He was a man who had finally learned how to rest, understanding that the greatest legacy one can leave is not a throne of gold, but a garden where others can grow without looking over their shoulders. The locket was closed, the debt was paid, and for the first time in his life, the dawn was just a beginning.